We're getting closer. We're getting closer to the end of the story. Somebody asked me about that when they saw it on the bulletin board this past week when we had the special services. And they said, we just saw a musical on that. I said, was it good? And they said, oh, it was great. I said, have you read the book? And they said, you mean the book, the story, or the book, the Bible? And I said, yes. Fortunately, they responded, yes. But it's exciting to be able to go through. We started in September. That Labor Day weekend, we started going through the book. That's the longest sermon series I've ever preached. But this has been good. This has been exciting. And now we're to the point where through this whole thing, we go through 28 chapters. And until we got to just a couple chapters into the life of Jesus, all of a sudden, this whole thing had been about the Jewish people. And now it becomes us as well. Now that doesn't mean that the first, that the Old Testament, first part of the New Testament doesn't have any application to us. On the contrary. But it is now becoming not just the story of the Jewish people, but it is becoming the story of all who embrace it and want to follow Jesus Christ. This is an exciting time. And this is not the time for us to kind of, we're almost at the end. Reminded the story of the little boy and the little girl up at the front of the church, and little girl was trying to be very intentional in listening to everything that was going on. Her brother wasn't cooperating. Little brother was busy making all kinds of noise and everything, and she said, "Shh! You're supposed to be quiet. Listen. How come we're supposed to be quiet in church?" Little girl says, "People are sleeping." Y'all must not be sleeping this morning. This is now where it gets good. Oh my goodness. This is good stuff. Besides that, there's people in the back called hushers. And they'll keep you quiet. Oh my goodness. So here we go. Here we go. Looking at the story where God starts to bring more and more Gentiles into the picture so that we might embrace God's story and really adopt it as our own story. We looked at the first part of the text that we're going to look at in chapter 29. And it is the story where Saul is confronted by God. Now, I have to admit, I have never been confronted by God like Saul was confronted by God. I have never been walking down the road and have a bright light shine on me and knock me to the ground and cause me to go blind. Never. But I've just got this funny feeling that just would scare whatever out of me if that were to happen. Now, for us to be able to understand what this is about with Saul, you've got to understand what type of person Saul was in the eyes of the early church. And I've heard all kinds of descriptions about how horrible he was and how his number one mission in life was to kill anyone that professed the name of Jesus Christ. And he was doing it because he thought and he understood that the people that followed Christ and made a point of worshiping him were not really understanding the true Jewish story. Now, for me, tough to understand that. It really was. But someone explained it to me just within the last few weeks. I got it. I understand what Saul must have been like to the Jewish church. It was like for the United States of America just a few years ago when you mentioned the name Osama bin Laden. Ooh, I heard a couple of oohs. Good. I mean, he was that hated, that despised, and feared in so many ways that we can't even imagine. Saul was hated. Well, that's probably a strong word, because Christians aren't supposed to hate. Saul was the fiercest, most dreaded enemy of the church that walked the face of the earth at that time. That's what type of person Saul was. Now, in the covenant, we have a deal where once a year we get together and we make out a prayer list. They used to call it Bringing My World to Christ. And then they called it 72. And then they called it, what's your next step? And they've kind of given it all kinds of names over the years. But it's for us to be able to list the people that we're going to be praying for over the year. Trust me, it would have taken an extremely mature Christian at that time to put Saul on their list. He was not well liked, and he was feared. What a remarkable turnaround for the church to be able to be put in a position where this man, who they dread, who they feared, who had intimidated them at every corner, was now going to become one of the leaders of the faith. This is tough stuff to grasp for us, and we've got 2,000 years to be able to process it. Well, no, we haven't lived that long. But, I mean, you know what I'm saying. For the church to be able to understand what that is all about, that's tough to comprehend. But yet, Saul was chosen by God to be a missionary to the Gentiles. To the Jews as well, but especially to the Gentile church. Now, as I read that story, I began to think there's some parts in it that just really jump out at me. God bless Ananias. God come to me and say that? Yikes. And Ananias, of course, you saw Ananias' first response was, God, do you know who we're talking? Are we talking the same Saul? We cannot be talking about the same guy. You cannot be talking about him. Not in this tone of voice. And God said, go to Saul and tell him that he will be my witness. Now, I don't know how long of a period of time it was between the time that God spoke to Ananias and Ananias spoke to Saul. I don't know how long of a period. A few minutes, a couple hours, maybe even a day. I don't know. But did you notice the first word that came out of the mouth of Ananias when he walked into the room and saw Saul? Anybody catch it? Okay, we'll go back. I just thought maybe. Because I think it's important for us to be able to see it. Ananias went and found Saul, and he laid his hands on him, and he said, Brother Saul. Holy smokes. What a transformation from the time that God appeared to Ananias and told him what he had to do to the time that Ananias was in the same room with Saul. That is a huge transformation. that went on in his life. You don't walk up to someone and say, brother, sister, flippantly. That's endearing. That's an embracing. That is, you are part of me. You are part of the family. And that's how Ananias started with Saul. Now, you may say, well, okay, tell me what's the deal. Tell me why this is so amazing. You start going through the New Testament, you start looking at all of the books that are written. Saul, after his name was changed to Paul, planted at least 10 churches. Churches in 10 areas and communities. 10 churches. He wrote one book shy of half of the New Testament. Is this guy important to us? He obviously is important to God. 13 of the 27 books in the New Testament were written by Paul. And some of the ones that we just go through and warmly embrace and make part of our own lives. It was one of the letters that he wrote to the church at Corinth goes in and talks about the importance of the relationship that you and I have to one another. It talks about that relationship that we should have with our brothers and sisters across town, across the county, across the state, across the country, and across the world. It talks to us about the importance for us to be able to grasp our importance of being united. Go into 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and it talks about all the parts of the body. And Paul, trying to explain to us, is that we cannot say to one part of the body, I don't need you. We can't get to the point where we can say, brothers and sisters, in the Pentecostal side of things, we don't need you. We can't get to the point where we say, brothers and sisters, on the Roman Catholic side, we don't need you. Brothers and sisters in mainline denominations, we don't need you. That may be enough to get me thrown out of here. Really? Paul is saying the importance of the church and the growth of the church is not going to come just from one little group of followers. It is going to come from all of us uniting together. In 2014, to be able to say, we are one. What was one? Thank you. Thank you, sweetheart. You didn't hear her. She just echoed me. That's better than amen. I'll tell you, I like that. And she's going to walk into somebody today and say, we are one.
She's listening.
I know it. I know it. God is calling us to embrace each other. What was Jesus' prayer? One of Jesus' prayers that are recorded in Scripture for us is his time with God. And he said, oh, Father, that they might be one like you and I are one. Oh, my goodness. Can you imagine us being united together as followers of Jesus Christ, no matter what our label? As God and Christ are one together? series on that one. Actually, there was a whole lifetime on that one. And then we realize how tough that was in the first century. How tough all of this uniting Jews and Gentiles that both wanted to follow Jesus, uniting them together and making a difference in the world. And who was at the forefront of those arguments, those discussions, that unification? It was Paul. You go ahead to Acts chapter 15, and it talks about the Council of Jerusalem, where they were trying to determine, the Jews were trying to say, hey, all these Gentiles need to be circumcised, they need to follow all of our rules about eating, and all this other stuff. And there's probably just a few people in the room going like, really? You really want them to do that? And everybody's saying, well, you know, if they're going to be a follower of God, they need to just kind of straighten up. They need to look like us. They need to talk like us. They need to act like us. Paul says, I hate to disappoint you folks, but no. And actually, the whole conversation that took place in Jerusalem at that time was recreated in one of Paul's writings in Galatians. The parallels are uncanny between that Council of Jerusalem and what the Galatian church was going through, and how they need to realize that, hey, we are one. We are not Jews and Gentiles. We are not slave and free. We are not ethnically divided. We are not racially divided nowadays. We are not divided by anything that cannot be united by Christ. This is big stuff. This is heavy duty. For those of us who claim to be following Jesus, this is life-changing. And sorry to say, we don't act like it. I'm not scolding you, I'm scolding me. Church universal, it's like, why don't we act like it? Why don't we act like we're united? Council had reached the conclusion that the Gentile Christians did not have to submit to all the Jewish law. And it created some problems. You know, how else are we going to be one? If we all have a different set of rules that we have to abide by. I think the question really is, I mean, the whole thing that this brings up, the initial part of Paul's ministry really comes down to this. It comes down to the idea of us understanding the love of Christ and the impact that that needs to make on our lives. You and I are here today in part because of what Paul did 20 centuries ago. Talk about part of the story. Holy smokes. It is. We are here today because of what God had called Paul to do. Opening the door to those other than the Jews so that we can be embraced and we can have this be part of our story. Paul was there in the early chapters in the book of Acts. He was there. He was on the outside looking in, but he was there. And when Jesus said in Acts chapter 1, go into all the world and preach the gospel. Call them to be followers of mine, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is your job. That was what Jesus was giving to his followers. Little did they know that their number one enemy would lead them down that road. And lead us up the road. So we could get on board. That's the good news of our story. Our story can be just so entwined with God's story that there's no way we can separate the two. That's what God has asked us to do. I remember hearing the story, and it was a baptism in a different mode than what we're going to celebrate in a little bit. A baptism where a family is brought together and they're in a lake. And one of their family members is going to be baptized. The pastor says what he needs to do, and he asks the questions that he asks, and then baptize this young man. And as soon as the young man came up out of the water, the entire family ran into the lake. Not to be rebaptized, but to embrace this young man as not just part of the family, but part of the family. Oh, may we do that as well. May we embrace what God has called us to do. To show our love, to unite together so that we can follow His desires for not only our lives, but for the life of the church. And when we do that, story goes on. We become part of it. That's what we need to do. We need to become part of that story and embrace it for our own. Let's pray. Gracious God, we ask